Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone, to all the teachers, welcome. In this short video, or in this video, I'll be showing how to use these forms and fill in these forms of the Quran to maintain the record and to be able to analyze the progress of the students, how quickly they are progressing, how well they are progressing. We've got two forms to do this. One form is the one that you see on the screen, and this one, it's called the master record. So it's the Tajweed recitation and Quran memorization students master record. In this one, we will record what level the student is at in the beginning, and then as they learn each new thing about the Quran memorization and Tajweed recitation, will keep on marking off what they are learning when they are learning. So that's what this paper is about. I will just introduce this paper now and then come back to it in detail later. This paper will be about students' name, how old they are, and their teachers. It will mention about them learning to read the Quran via the 6-part Iqra book series. So the Iqra book series, Iqra 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each of these books teach how to read the Quran step by step, beginning in book 1 about simply the Arabic alphabet, and then moving on in book 2 about the vowel, so the Arabic alphabet saying ba, bi, bu, and so on. That's book 2. Then you move on as you go higher to learn to join 2, 3 letters together to make a word, then a phrase and a sentence. That's what these 6 books are about. At the end of the 6 books, a student is expected to know how to be able to read the Quran. However, they may not be able to do that perfectly. For that, we will then, once the 6 books are completed, we will move on to the next section here, which is teaching the makharij al-huruf, and that is about pronouncing the letters properly. So pronouncing dhal as it should be dha, as distinct from za, which is different. So this is what the second level of Quran reading is. The Iqra series level teaches us how to read a sentence and connect letters and so on and read a whole sentence. The Makharij al-Huruf section teaches us how to pronounce the Arabic alphabet properly as it should be pronounced. Then once that is completed, the student moves on to learning about the med, the different types of med. And this is about how much to prolong in different situations. A normal med, pronounced 2 counts. A med where there is a hamza, pronounced 4 or 5 counts. A med which is due to a sukoon, pronounced 2, 4, or 6 for some types, or 6 for other types, and then some of the other med that are there. So this is the third main section taught in how to read the Quran, which is the section of med. Once the student finishes that, they move on to the fourth section, which is the one on the right here. And this is learning about how to read when there is a noon sakina or tanween or mim sakina. And then how to do with regards to them, how to either pronounce the letter fully, which is idhar, or to merge the letter in the one that's coming after it, which is idgham, or to hide the letter partially, which is ikhfa, or to transform it and change it to something else, which is iqlab. So these we'll be learning in the fourth section of the learning of the Quran. After the fourth section, we'll go to a miscellaneous section where the student begins by learning how to pronounce the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala correctly with respect to tafkhim and tarqiq. Then we would like the student to move on to learning the rules of starting in the beginning of a sentence from pause. Then we'll talk about the rules for how to stop. Then about pronouncing the letter Ra with respect to tafkhim and tarqiq in different situations. Once this miscellaneous is done, so we've done 4 topics and a miscellaneous, then we move to the last topic. Sorry, I made a mistake. No, I didn't make a mistake. So yeah, so we've done 4 topics. Iqra is topic 1, Makharij topic 2, Mad topic 3, Idgham and all of that topic 4, and then miscellaneous, and then the 5th and last topic is the sifat of the huruf, meaning what is the characteristic of each letter. This is sort of like the perfecting it and completing it. So in Iqra, we learn simply, what to identify the letters and to be able to merely pronounce them, join them together, read a word, read a sentence. In Makharij, we learn how to pronounce each letter precisely. In Sifat, we learn how to make the sound of each letter. When we're pronouncing it from a proper place, that is Makharij al-Huruf, pronouncing it precisely from a proper place it should be. In Sifat, it's about what kind of sound with which to pronounce it with. As an example, you might pronounce the, which is a flat letter where your mouth is flat, thal, and then you might pronounce from a very similar place, the. And can you see that the the is a hollow sound as opposed to thal, which is a flat sound? So these are talking about the type of sound to make, whether it is like a balloon full mouth sound or a flat mouth sound. That is the sifat of the huruf right at the end, and that is topic number 5. So this document, the student master record of their recitation and memorization, documents these 5 levels. Beginning from here, as they learn each of the Iqra book, you tick that. As they learn each of the letter how to pronounce it, you tick that. And every time you tick something, you write the date when that was accomplished next to it. Then you move on to the med, and you teach that, and when each of the type of med is done, you put a tick and write the date when it is completed. Then you move on to talking about the idgham in that. When each of them are finished, put a tick and write the date when it's finished. Same for the miscellaneous and same for the sifat of the huruf. This is to do about reciting the Quran with tajweed. As for memorizing the Quran, the bottom half of this page talks about it, or the bottom section of it. So here, as you can see, we've got all the 114 surah of the Quran written, and they're deliberately written very small so that they don't disturb from what you need to write and distract attention from there. So you've got for each surah, as you can see there, for each surah you've got the surah number, and then you've got the surah name. And what we intend to do with each of them is when a student has memorized a particular surah, then for example Surah Fatiha, you tick that they memorized it and you write next to it the date when they finish memorizing it. If it's a long surah, for example, if it's a long surah, such as surah, let's take a surah that might be long for many students, yet they might be memorizing it. So take as an example Surah Yasin. So if they're memorizing Surah Yasin, a longer surah, then what you do is, if they're still memorizing it but they haven't finished it, so let's say they've memorized a few verses of Yasin, they've memorized a few verses of Surah Kahf, they've memorized a few verses of Surah Mulk, for example, which is somewhere down here. So then what you do is you simply write here in a small writing what verses they've memorized of Yasin, of Kahf, and of Mulk. When they finally finished it, then you come back and you do a tick and write next to it the date when that was finished. But if they are actively memorizing a particular surah, then you do not write every time a verse is memorized. You don't write that. If they're actively memorizing a surah, you could simply leave it alone, and when they finish memorizing it, then you come and you tick it to say it is complete. But sometimes students memorize many surahs, so then you go to each one of them, and then whichever surah they are memorizing a certain number of verses, you simply go to that and write that. Otherwise, each surah they finish memorizing, put a tick and the date they finish memorizing. Obviously, we'll be starting from the bottom right, which is the small surah, and making our way up and up and up. And I've written here the juz number, juz 30, juz 29, juz 28, and so on. So that helps us to know. So this is a record of what they have memorized. Lastly is a comment section. You might want to write something about the student that is relevant to what they're doing, and you write that over there. Now, if ever there is something that is in progress and you want to write that they're still learning it and it's not complete, if you wanted to write it somewhere, whether it's to do with mud or anything, simply write WIP, and that stands for work in progress. WIP, work in progress. So for example, if they're doing a big surah like Surah Baqarah, and so then simply write WIP, you know that that's the one they're working at. If they finished it, just cross across WIP, put a line across it, cross it, and then just put a tick to say the surah has been completed. So here is this record, the master record of their Tajweed recitation and memorization. This is pretty much as much really as anybody needs to know, and we don't really need to come back to this for a general Quran teacher because they may not know each of these. Um, However, there are a few things that I guess it would help to know, and we'll come to it at the end. Now, let's go to the actual page that everybody needs to know, every Quran needs to know. This, what we saw, is the record that we make in the beginning. Once we make this record in the beginning of the year for each student, and this stays the same for 3, 4, 5 years as the student progresses, learning more and more and more. The second record, which everybody has to deal with every day, is this one. Here is the page that is about the Quran learning record of the student. So the Quran learning record of the student, as you can see, it is a page that is this long. So in this page that is A4 size long, at the top is the student name and number, what class they belong to, like C0, C1, C2, C3, C4B for boys, C4G for girls class, and then C5B for boys, C5G for girls class, and then the name of the Quran teacher or teachers for that particular term. Across here, what year level they're in, what term they're in. So that is their thing. And then 1 to 10 is the week. Each term is 10 weeks long. So as you come across each week, just write down here under the number 1, 2, 3, what is the date of that week that you are teaching on. And then you fill across going to the right in that column. And then you do that for all of them. At the bottom is comment section, and especially importantly, a report writing section for the end of that term. So at the bottom, you simply do a report of how they went that term, what they have learned, and what they are to do next term. So that way, the next term, people would know where to go from there, and any comments regarding them. Now, let's have a look at this paper closely, because everyone will be dealing with this. Every Quran teacher or form teacher will be dealing with this every week with their students allocated to them. And so here we have a closer view of all of this. So please keep in mind, here is a student name. Now, every Quran teacher that is teaching will have 3, 4, or 5, or 6 students assigned to them. Now, ideally, it would be good to have only fewer students, like 3 or 4, but even up to 5 might be something that the teacher can bear. So then each teacher will have one paper for each of the students assigned to them per each class they're attending every hour. So for the first hour, they might have 5 students. Second hour in another class, they might have 4 students. Third hour in another class, they might have 6 students. So they have that many papers of this with each teacher for the day. At the end of the day, when they fill this in for the day, they give it to the admin who is looking after this, or the senior staff who's responsible for this, hand it over to them all the papers, and then next week pick it up from them once again. The reason it's good to leave it with the admin at the school is so everyone's papers are together. So if a teacher is away next week, then the papers are already there at the school. Another emergency substitute teacher can take it up and continue with that. So each teacher is going to have a set of these papers for each class they're teaching. What the teacher will do each day, each time, is you look what week you're in. So for example, the coming Sunday for us is the 3rd week of this term. So you look at what week of the term you are at. So now the coming week is the 3rd term, and that is the 11th of February 2018. So just write here in small writing 11 Feb 18, or write 11/02/18. And then here, as you see, you have 3 columns. What are these columns for? The first column, it's about Quran memorization. The second column is about Quran recitation with proper tajweed. The third column is about the homework for Quran memorization and recitation, or any other comments that may be there. So these are the 3 columns and what they have to do with for each week that is across here. So for each week, when a teacher comes to a student for a class that may be 1 hour long, we would like you to divide the class in half. Half an hour spent with memorization, half an hour spent with recitation with Tajweed. So for you come for the first half hour, you do the memorization, fill up all of this, and whatever the homework for hifz memorization is, write it over here. HW hifz, write their homework. Second hour, you do the recitation. When you finish that and assign homework, write all the relevant parts here. And as for the homework, come across here, write HW recitation, and write what homework you have assigned. So this is generally what we'll be doing. Now, the way the teacher will deal, given that they might have 4 different students to deal with, or 3 different students, or 5 different students, is as follows. So picture this, a teacher puts in front of them their 4 students that they are responsible for. The teacher begins in the first half an hour doing memorization with those 4 students. The teacher asks student number 1 on the right hand side, all 4 students sitting in front of the teacher, facing the teacher, close to one another. Teacher begins with student number 1 and says to student number 1, read from memory what you were supposed to have memorized as homework from last week that we practiced last week. So the student will read, for example, in Surah An-Naba, the student's homework was to memorize verses 6 to 10 as an example. So the student reads verses 6 to 10 of Surah Naba, and the teacher listens, and the other 3 students are sitting listening. While they do that, then if the student recites them correctly and they've memorized it well, satisfactorily, and the teacher wants to move on, so the teacher writes here Naba V6 to 10. Tick. What that's saying is Surah Naba, verses 6 to 10, they have memorized it, and you put a tick, meaning they've memorized it. Then you write NW next to it. You leave a bit of space and write NW for next week over here. And then you write NW and write Naba V11 to 15, or 11 to 12, or 11 to 20, whatever it may be. So meaning you're saying for next week, what you want the student to do for next week is to do Surah Naba versus this to this to this. And that we have written over here. Now in this situation, the student memorized that, and that is what they are supposed to do next week as well, that you have given to them. And because that's their homework for parents to do, the next week part is for the teacher next week to know what to do. Now, what is the homework that you've given them? The same thing that they're supposed to read for next week. So then the teacher comes across here and writes HW Hifz for memorization, HW Hifz, and then writes here Naba V11 to 15. So Surah Naba verses 11 to 15 is the homework to memorize at home. And this is what the teacher writes down over here. And then they may take the student's homework book, and in the homework book, they will write for the parents for today. They write their homework for Quran memorization. Homework is to memorize Surah Naba verses 11 to 15 for next week. And that's in the homework section. The teacher has done this for student number 1. As for writing the homework part, the teacher can do that at the end of half an hour for every student. But for now, the teacher listens to the student. The student has completed their Surah Naba verses 6 to 10. Successfully, teacher puts a tick, NW Naba V11 to 15 for next week. Then the teacher moves to the second student and asks them to read what was their homework. What their homework was to do for this week is written in the previous week here as NW. So they look at that and then they ask the student to read that now from memory. If the student reads it successfully, put a tick, write what they have to do for next week, and write it across here as HW homework for next week. But if the student didn't memorize it successfully, then put a cross next to it. So write down Naba V6 to 10 cross, and then space NW Naba V6 to 10. Or you can just write NW, same. The next week they're supposed to do the same. So then you say to the student, you haven't memorized it, keep reading it now while other students are doing their part. Whereas the first student who successfully memorized their part, when they finished memorizing, you gave them the next verses to keep reading, and you said, I'll come back to you. But if they don't know how to read the next verses, then simply ask them to keep reading what they've memorized now and previously of the same surah. Ask them to keep reading that, or to listen to keep reading that, and then move to the second student, move to the third and fourth student. Each student write down what they memorize as we just described, what they have to do next week, and what their homework is. Once you've done that with each student, and do this swiftly, and don't waste time on that. So it should really take with each student about 3 minutes. Because you say to a student, okay, you were meant to read Surah Naba verses 5 to 10. Go verses 6 to 10. Go ahead. And the student reads verses 6 to 10 of Surah Naba. If they're successful, you put a tick, write NW, and you say, great, read the next part, and I'll come back to you soon. If they didn't, you try to help them. If they're still struggling, simply write down that you're continuing that. As I said before, write the verses, write NW, write same. And then you say to them, keep reading those verses, and you move to the next person. Can you see that it should take more or less 3 minutes maximum per student? You've done that for all the 4 students. Then you come back, and with each student, you get them now this time to read the new portion that they have to memorize now and next week. And you get them to read the new portion. Get them to repeat the new portion with you. Once you feel that they seem reasonably able to read that new portion, you say to them, keep repeating that, because great memory comes from repetition. Ask them to keep repeating it, then you move to the next student, next student. Now imagine all the 4 students are right in front of you, so it's simply your head turning. You never leave students go out of your sight, otherwise you don't know what they may be doing. So keep them in the sight, be attentive to all of them. Be aware of all of them, be attentive to one of them, and you go through all the 4 students like this. This time you read to each of them their new portion, and you do that, and once you've done that, then you come back, and if there's still time remaining in the half an hour, then with each student simply listen to something they have revised, something they've memorized in the past. So come to this bottom past thing here and look at what they memorized from the past by looking at previous weeks, what they have successfully memorized. And whatever they memorized recently successfully, revise that today. And whatever you've revised, simply write here saying Naba V1 to 10. All the 10 verses, you've now revised it. So what you do is Naba V1 to 10, tick. That's all. And then you leave it there. Now, if you want to suggest for the teacher to revise a specific part next week, then here in the revised area, write NW and what you suggest for them to read for next week. This is the memory part. We do the similar stuff now for the recitation part. As for the recitation part, some students will be learning only the mere recitation of learning what are the Arabic letters, how to do ba, bi, bu, ta, ti, tu, and so on. So then that is students learning the Iqra books, how to simply read. And for those people who are doing Iqra books, there is no Tajweed at that level. So you're simply teaching Iqra books. So you fill the recitation today, recitation next week, and you don't fill anything in the Tajweed taught today or next week for students doing the Iqra level. So you come here and the student might be doing Iqra book 3, page 8, lines 1 to 6. So you come here, you look at last week, what you had written for recitation next week, and now ask the student to recite that for today. That's the new lesson where the student is doing a new set of lines today. You don't need to revise the previous ones if they've already done it well. So you come here, you recite what you wrote previously to do this week, and you recite that with the student and you teach them how to recite it. Get the student number 1 to recite that. When the student number 1 has recited it, write down what you've done today. So you write B3 for book 3 of Iqra, and you write P8 for page 8, and then capital L, and then you write that's the lines, and you might write, for example, if it was lines 1 to 8, you write L1-8. That's what they've done today. If you were happy with what they did, put a tick and leave it. But if they need to work on it and get better at it, then put that across as HW, homework for recitation, and write there B3 P8 L1-8. So that's the homework to tell the parents. And in the homework book, you'll be writing down at the end of the class, you'll be writing down saying to the parents, homework for Quran recitation, please get your child to practice reading Iqra book 3, page 8, lines 1 to 8. So this is the homework to do with this. Previously, you had homework to do with memorization. Coming back here, that was if the student didn't read those properly. But if they did read those properly, then you simply write here, as I said, B3 P8 L1-8 tick. And if they hadn't done it, we put a cross. And for next week, you write the same thing because that is what they are still working on. But if you're ready to move on, then you write if they've done that practice today, so you get them to read that. Don't just get them to read it once, get them to read it a couple of times. So you get them to read that maybe once or so now, and you can come back to it later. And then once they've done it, you write it here and write here for N, capital W next week, and then write here B3 P8 L 9 to 15. Iqra book 3, page 8, lines 1 and lines 9 to 15. You write that over here. There's no tajweed at this level, you leave that. The homeworks have now been filled, and you fill that at the end of the class in the student record. Of course, that's at the end of the class. But for now, when you get the student to read their recitation part, then tell them to keep reading that or some of the lines from the past as you see fit and appropriate. And in that meantime, while they're reading something, you move to the second student, get the second student, look at what they read, what was said last week that they should do this week in recitation. Now read that with the student. And then once you finished it, write here, book whatever, page whatever, lines whatever, done successfully, put a tick, and then write here for next week's teacher what lines or page you want them to do next week. And if there was any homework required because they were not learning well, then write the homework here. But if homework was not required, maybe you can just leave it as homework for hifl that they need to do because that's fair, a fair amount by itself. So this is for students who are still learning the Iqra books, how to read the Quran. For students that's finished reading the Iqra books and learn how to read the Quran, we now go to getting them to read Quran properly, meaning with the Tajweed. Tajweed, as we know, is simply doing it well. That's what it means, doing it well, making it good. So then that's what Tajweed is. And as we saw in the other form, let's have a look at it now. In the other form, we had seen before that a student, when they've begun learning Tajweed, this is what they are doing. So they first learn the Iqra books, then they learn how to pronounce each individual letter properly, then they learn the Mad, and then they learn the idgham and all of that of the nun sakina, min sakina. Then they learn a few miscellaneous issues. Then they learn the sifat. I mean, that's the way we want to teach it. So now, given that they've done the Iqra, now we want to teach them how to pronounce each letter from the proper spot in the mouth or the throat, and to pronounce it from the proper spot precisely as it should be from the precise spot. So this is known as makharij al-huruf. So next we want to teach this to the students. In order to teach this to the students, we will now come here. So in week 3, if a student is at the level of learning that and they finish Iqra books, so then what we do is they finish reading Iqra books, so we get them to start reading the Quran. So we ask the students to start reading from Surah Fatiha and keep going until the end of the Quran. Each week they might read one verse if they're very young, or even if they're older, they can't do more, they read just one verse. Sometimes they read longer verses. And I would like them not to do the surah at the end of the Quran. The reason is some of the verses at the end of the Quran are short, very powerful, and not that easy to pronounce. And therefore, some of the earlier verses are easier to pronounce and read. So that's why we're beginning from the beginning. And of course, another benefit of that is the student feels good that I'm reading the whole Quran. I've reached 1/3 of the Quran, half of the Quran, and so on. So you get the student to read. So for example, this student might be reading Surah Baqarah, verse number 50. So then you write here for this student, Baqarah V50-55. So the student is going to read today Baqarah verses 50 to 55. The student reads it. If they're successful, you put a tick next to it. And then you go to the right here and write capital NW for next week and write Baqarah V56 to 65. So that's for next week to do. Just like previous week, you had written here what to do this week. So you looked at that and you came in, you did it this week. So what you write here to do for next week the teacher will do the same, for that week. So you write here, they're reading Surah Baqarah verses 50 to 60, for example, whatever that was. As the student is reading that, you want to be able to do implementation of the Tajweed rule they're learning for the day. And what Tajweed rule are they going to learning for the day? Are they going to learn for the day? That you come back to this one here. So you see that first teach the students the alphabet that is not resembling another part of the alphabet. So a, ba doesn't resemble other letters. So start with letters that don't resemble others. A, ba, jim, ra, sheen, and then gha, ghain, fa, and then lam, mim, noon, wow, and ya. Do these letters first because they don't really resemble other letters much. Do these letters first where you get them to pronounce them properly. So you begin the recitations half an hour and you say, okay, I see here from last week, it said for Tajweed next week, you were supposed to practice the letter Sheen. So now you begin the half an hour. You take the first student and you say you go to practice the letter Sheen and you get them to say the letter Sheen, we pronounce it like this from here. And it's pronounced as sha, she, shu. And then, or you also teach them to say ash, ish, or ush. These are just different ways. But basically just get them to pronounce the letters properly. And once they're doing that, you spend the first 1 minute or so teaching them how to pronounce the letter properly. And once you've taught them how to pronounce the letter properly, just write here that you've, sheen, tick. Teach them how to do it and ask them to do it themselves. When they can say it properly, write sheen, tick. And then get them to read the Surah Baqarah verses for today and pay attention to the verse of the day, which is sheen. Sorry, the letter of the day or Tajweed rule being taught of the day, and get them to read that. Once they've done it, you write Baqarah V55 to 60, tick. Next week, NW, Baqarah V61 to 70. Come across here, write the homework if you needed to, if they needed to learn anything. But if they didn't need to, as I said, it's enough to leave them with the hifz to memorize. So then you do this for student 1. They read their verses and you say to the other students that you can either, if they're struggling with memorization, tell them revise your memorization until I come to you. If they're doing well with memorization, you can ask them to read another part of their own Iqra book or of the Quran. But in my experience, I would suggest that it's best if you ask them to keep reading again and again the new portion to memorize. So you do the first student while other students are revising their memorization from the previous half an hour. Then when the first student is finished, you write it, move to the second student, get the second student to see from the last week what Tajweed rule they had to learn, teach them that rule for the first 1 or 2 minutes, get them to say it themselves, get them to read their own verses and check the Tajweed rule in it. If they've done it successfully, put a tick, write the set of verses to read for next week. And then you say to that student, great, go back and now revise the new portion of the Quran you're memorizing from the previous half an hour. You move to the third student, the fourth student, like that. And this, if you have time, you come back to the 4 students again. But you probably won't have time. But you've done the work, which is you've taught them a new thing how to pronounce properly. You've taught them you've helped them to read more of the Quran more precisely and more correctly. So you've done that, you've written the homework. At the end of the 1 hour, write the homework for each of the 4 students. Write the homework very briefly, but don't use abbreviation because the parents won't understand. Write it very briefly saying, please get, you just very briefly saying, please memorize Surah Naba verses 11 to 15 for homework. That's it. And then do your signature there and so on. If you wanted them to do practice of a Tajweed rule, you can write that as well. So basically, this is what the teachers will be doing for this week. Next week, when the teacher comes back, week 4, they will come, they will write down for each student what the date is today. And then they will look at this student for the first half an hour. They say, all right, now from last week, what were you supposed to memorize for next week? You now get them to do that. And then if they've done it well, tick it and write for the next week the next portion to memorize. And then you go to the other students, come back, and when you come back to the student, get them to practice the new portion in front of you. If they hadn't memorized, then just put a X cross and then put for next week the same thing and put that in the homework. And then you do that. If there's time to revise, you revise the past stuff, and then you move on in the second half hour to teaching them a new thing, how to pronounce a certain letter, and then getting them to read the part of the Quran, and then checking that they read that letter properly. If they're still on Iqra books, you do the Iqra books with them. Now, as I said before, when you're teaching them the letters how to pronounce, you start with the letters that are easy to pronounce. But then after that, you have to move to the letters that are a bit difficult to pronounce and resembling other letters. Example of that are here. You see here. So you see here for the more difficult letters to pronounce. So you come, for example, to ta. So you've taught all the easy letters. Now you're starting from the right. And this week, when you come here, now this week for Tajweed, you have to do some difficult letter. So then you come, letter ta, and ta resembles ta. So now take both of those letters together. And then you teach the student how to pronounce ta and ta together. So you come to the beginning of the class in this week and teach them how to say ta and teach them how to say ta and show them the difference between the two. This might take you 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depends on the student. So then teach them that, and as you're teaching them ta and ta, write here ta, comma, ta. If they finished learning it this week and they could say it themselves properly, they know where to pronounce it from, and they're pronouncing it from the correct spot, then put a tick that they're finished. And put here NW and choose the next set of difficult verses, difficult letters, and that is Tha, Sin, Sod. So then you get them to do this next. So you come back here and you write NW for next week and write Tha, comma, Sin, comma, Sod. And you leave it at that. No need to put that as a homework because the parents are not teachers to be able to teach this. So just leave it there. Next week when you come, you pick it up for that student. You see here that they have to do Tha, Sin, Sod. So you come and you teach them that. Now, how do we go about teaching it? You begin a class and you see what is the thing to teach of the Tajweed this time. So the thing to teach for this week was Ta and Ta. So you begin and spend the first 1 or 2 minutes saying you say Ta and you say Ta, and the difference between them two is the one, Ta is pronounced more from this part towards the tip of the tongue. Ta is pronounced almost the same place, just a little bit behind, and touching a little bit behind on the upper palate. And then he said that the ta is with a flat mouth, whereas ta is with a balloon-like mouth. So ta is like a balloon-like mouth and ta is like that. You show them, you get them to do it themselves, and then if they've done it successfully, then you simply put a tick over here. Now, here you don't need to go to the rest of the sifat of the huruf. You just want to show them the makhraj and just the distinction between this letter and that letter. The rest of the distinction will come in the sifat later on. So you've done that, you write ta, comma, ta, and tick. And then for next week, you write tha, sin, sad. Once you've done this for the first 2 minutes showing ta, ta, and getting them to say it themselves, ta, ti, tu, ta, ti, tu. Once you've done that, and then you, of course, as I say, it's good to teach them also like this by saying at, alpo, like that. So you get them to say that, and then you move on to the recitation. They start reading Surah Baqarah, whatever it was said from last week. So they're reading Surah Baqarah, verse 50 to 55, and you pay attention to to the letter ta and ta in these verses they're reading. So that's how our Quran reading learning session, half an hour, is gonna be. And then you write that, and next week the teacher continues from that. So as you can see from this form, that's what we do week after week. Just to summarize this part, you come, write the date, then check from the previous week what they were supposed to memorize this week, then what they're supposed to memorize for this week. Sorry, what they memorize new when it says next week, meaning that's what they were supposed to memorize new. So you come and you listen to that now. If they memorize it, you write it and put a tick, and then write what's the next few verses for next week, go to the other student. When you come back, you get them to read the new verses with you together. Then you go to the other students and do the same. Then when you come back, if there's time remaining in the half an hour, revise past memorized sections. In the second half hour, you go and look at the Tajweed rules to learn from previous week what it said to do next week, which is now. You look at the Tajweed rules, begin the first 1-2 minutes teaching them those Tajweed rules. If they've learned it well, put a tick, and for next week write something else. Then move on to reading, and when you read, be alert and pay attention to these new Tajweed rules. If someone is not up to this stage, they're still doing Iqra, then look at the previous week, see what they were supposed to read this week in Iqra book recitation, get them to read that now, and then when they've read that, write what they have to do next week. And when you've written what they have to do next week from all of that, then you finish the section. Be sure you've written the homework of the hifz to do at home. And if there was homework, so you write it as HW hifz, what to do. And if it's to do with homework of Tajweed, if you need to, if you don't need to leave it, if you need to write HW, Tajweed, and what homework to do. You do this week after week after week. And this is this form that is there. So I hope you can see from here now, we've seen both of these forms, how to do them week after week. This is the Quran learning record week after week. It changes from term to term. And this is the Quran master record where everything of the student is written there. It might stay there for years. Now, I want to just briefly retouch on this before finishing, because many people will not know all of this. Many Quran teachers may only be able to teach the Iqra level or maximum the Makharij Huruf level. But I'll just briefly mention about this once again as a summary before finishing this. But in a summary, I'll just add a few more points to it. So please do listen to it. So we write the student name, and the admin may add the student number. We write the month and year. For example, you write 02/2018 if someone was born on that day. Then you write here the name of the Quran teachers. Then you begin teaching students Iqra books. That might take 6 months, it might take 2 years, it might take 3 years. You teach them Iqra book. As you finish each book, put a tick and write the date when it was finished. Then next book and next book. When all of these are finished, you move to the location from which to pronounce the letters. And then you come to the Makharij al-Huruf, start with the easy letters. As each letter is learned, you put a tick next to it and put the date when it was taught, when it was learnt, not taught, when it was learnt, finished, learnt. And then you move on to the other letters and keep doing the same. With difficult letters that resemble one another, take a whole set of them together, like ta and ta together, and then tha and sin and sad together, and so on. Once you've done, so this will take a lot, this will take some time, but not a lot of time. This will take some time to teach students how to do this. Once you've done this, then move on to teaching the students the different mad. When it comes to teaching the different mad, my suggestion is to begin by teaching the students from mad al-tabi'i, mad al-asli, nuhiha, 2 count elongation. And then after that, maybe it's best to move to teaching mad al-fara'i, starting from mad due to a hamza coming after a mad formation. So you have a mad formation, which is a, e, u. and after that comes a hamza. Hamza, hamza. So there's a followed by hamza, e followed by hamza, u followed by hamza within the one word. So you prolong this mad 4 to 5 times. So you teach them this, and and this will be taught, of course, going back here in this recitation section. You teach them that, and when they have learned that, then you put a tick and the date it was completed teaching to the student. For the teachers who are teaching at this level, be sure to teach them the Arabic names for this. So you would say to them that this is a al-mad al-far'i. You say al-mad al-far'i, and you say this is al-mad al-muttasil al-wajib al-kalimi. So you teach them the Arabic word of the mad itself. Once you've done that, I suggest you move on to the mad, where there's a mad formation followed by a hamza, but the mad formation is at the end of the first word, like here tubu, and it finishes with u, which is a mad formation, dhamma with a long waw, and then the next word begins with hamza, and thus it becomes a 4 or 5 elongated mad. So this is the next type of mad to teach, tubu ilallah, right? So you teach that one to the people. Once you've taught that, put a tick and the date it was taught on. Then I suggest after that to move on to mad due to sukoon, and begin, of course, with mad due to a temporary sukoon, al-mad al-arid li-sukoon. Teach that one such as bayt, khawf, like that. Teach that one with 2, 4, or 6 count. Explain to them what all those are, and then you put a tick and the date when you finished. Then you move on to the mad that is due to a sukoon and it is within the word. So al-mad al-lazim, and that is due to the sukoon, and it is al-kalimi. And then there is the muthaqqal, where the sukoon actually has a mad there. And there's mukhaffaf, where it is sukoon and not a mad. So you teach them what these are in the regular section here, and you spend some time there. For some of them more complicated, you spend more time there. So when you finish when you finish this one, and they've learnt it well, they can recall it, they can read it when they're reading the Quran, they automatically know how to read that. Then put a tick and put the date it was learnt. Do the same for the heavy, the light of this med. Then you move on to the med that is due to the sukoon, but it is within the same letter, such as hamim, so the med in the meme. So you teach them that med, the mukhaffaf and the muthaqqal, the light and the hard, heavy. You teach them both of those, and when each of them is finished, put a tick and the date it's finished. After that, it would be good to move on to the med as-sila, sila. So in the med as-sila, it's good to teach med as-sila as-sughra first. When they've learnt it, you teach them med as-sila al-kubra. Again, when each is learned, put a tick and the date next to it. Then you could move on to mad al-badal, mad al-iwad, mad al-tamkeen, mad al-farq, and the mad al-lin. So teach them all of these ones after that, one after the other. Once they've learned all the mad earlier, then the mad of badal, iwad, tamkeen, farq, and lin should be very easy to get thereafter. So once you've done this section, this is the third main section. The first main section of learning to read Quran was Iqra. Second was the location to pronounce each letters from, makharij al-huruf. The third is the mad, the different types of mad. The fourth major section, it's about nun sakina and tanween and mim sakina. In here, I suggest you begin teaching al-idhar first, because the letters of the idhar are the most natural ones to say, because you don't need to merge, nor do you need to hide or do partial concealing. Instead, you pronounce it fully. So you teach the idhar letters first, and you may spend 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks on that. Once they've learnt it, right here, put a tick and the date. Then I suggest move on to idgham, and teach them the idgham first, what that is, merging with the shadda. Once they've learnt it, then alert them and teach them that there are 2 letters where there's no ghunna and 4 where there is a ghunna. And as they learn this first stage of just knowing what idgham is and being able to do it properly, you may want to put a tick and a date. Then when they've learned without ghunna, with ghunna, put a tick and a date. That's done. The next I suggest to do third is the third in terms of the ease in ascending order. You come to the ikhfa, and there are so many letters to do. You teach them what ikhfa is, and then take one letter at a time. As each letter is taught, just put a tick next to it. You don't have to put the full date. You can put a tick next to it. If you put the date, it helps, but you don't have to. There's not much space either. So you can just put a tick or circle it. When you finished all of them, then do make sure to put a tick, for example, here and the date here. Or you can put a tick here and a date here when that's finished. Then finally, you move to the Noon and Sakina, Noon, Sakina and Tanween with ba coming after it, where it will be a iqlab. And then you teach them the iqlab. When they've learned that, then you do um, the tick and the date. Of course, wherever the ghunna comes, be sure to let them know about that as well. Then you move on to the meme sakina rules, and your best obviously would be to start teaching with the idgham, because that's the easiest to know and learn, and then to teach the ikhfa of the meme sakina with the ba after it, and then the remaining, which are all idhar. Once, as each is learned, please put a tick and a date next to it. So this is section number 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Once you've done this section 4, you move on to section 5. Actually, when you finish section 4, then you can move on to, let's say you call it section 5, and that is miscellaneous section. And in section 5, which is miscellaneous, I recommend starting with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. About pronouncing it with tafkhim, if the vowel sign before it is fatha or dhamma, and with tarqiq if the vowel sign before it is kasra, because that's the easiest to learn. Once you've done that, you may want to move on to the rules for starting. Teach all of those ones, and finished, put a tick here and the date when it's finished. Same with the rules for stopping, when to stop, when not to stop, when to have a full complete stop, when to have a partial temporary stop. So teach, when you've taught all that, a tick and you put the date. And last in the miscellaneous section, you move on to the letter Ra, because there you'll be teaching them tafkhim and tarqiq, which is part of the sifat. Next section, you teach them the Ra. Once you've done it, put a tick and put the date. Now we finish section number 5. Finally, we come to the last section of the Tajweed, which is the sifat. And here you'll teach all the sifat of each type of sifat, the sifat that have an opposite, so you teach both opposite types, makes it easy. Sifat that don't have the opposite, you teach those ones as well. So once you've finished all the sifat, as you do each one of them, write the sifat that are done. If you've done the ones with opposite, just write them both in one part here and write when they were both finished, and then you move through all of those sifat here of the huruf. If there's any other miscellaneous there that I have not written here, then simply write that. I would suggest maybe here in the miscellaneous at the bottom. So this is how we finish doing all the record of this. And then one last important thing, as the students memorize each surah, tick that surah, so tick and the date next to it. With the longer surah, as I mentioned before, if a student, when they come to the class, they've memorized a few verses from Surah Taha, a few from Yasin, and they memorized a few verses from Surah Jumu'ah, and so on, then simply go to each surah everywhere and write the few verses they've memorized with small writing. Later on, when it comes to them memorizing that whole surah, each surah you're working on, you can write next to it WIP, work in progress, WIP, work in progress, and then work on it, work on it, work on it. A few weeks later, you finish memorizing it, put a tick and the date when it was finished, and then you move on to the next surah. And I would strongly recommend that the way I'd like us to do is start from Surah An-Nas and just move backwards. The reason being that with little kids, it really helps them to go from the smallest to higher. At home, they may be excited about a surah out of the order, but in the class, it's better to just follow a routine that everybody else is doing. So you start from the back, keep going up, and do all this surah. Of course, don't forget Surah Fatiha in the beginning. And I've also written the juz. Now, please remember, the juz are not exactly, so for example, Surah Safat is where it's in Juz 23. All this is saying is Surah Safat is the first surah that begins in Juz 23. Although the last few verses of Yasin may well be in Juz 23 as well. But that's not really important for us to know that. So that's why, and we can easily check it in the Musaf. But I wrote it just for our own benefit. So just to sum this up again, if a student has memorized a few verses of many surah, write under each surah what those verses are with small writing. If a student is memorizing a surah at the moment, you can write WIP, work in progress, next to it. Once they've completed it, then scratch across WIP and then put there a tick and the date when they finish memorizing it. And so this is how we'll be doing this section. And can you see that? I hope we can see that this really helps us when we are doing the other learning record and so on. It helps us to look at this, and with all the dates and different things, you can see exactly, you can get one glance look at this. And as you just take one look at this from far, you will get a complete picture of where the student stands. So you can analyze how well the student is memorizing by seeing how quickly the dates are moving in this order, how quickly they're memorizing, how well they're memorizing, are they progressing, are they not progressing. So this form, we can do that. Now, if we want to keep this form in a digital format, one way of doing it is if we get one of our volunteers to enter all this data online, but for so many students that may be quite difficult. Another way of doing it is simply to take a photo, a scan of it, and keep it on our online record. So that's how we can do. Sometimes we tend to get excited and we want to do everything digitally and we want to do it, but really quite often we get excited, we do things, we put so much effort, but we don't, when it comes to actually implementing it, we don't implement it. So that's why it's good to balance between what is technologically good, time saving and efficient versus what is practical that we're actually going to do. So I hope we see that this is one form that helps us to get a good complete picture, and this is another form, and this will keep changing term after term. Please don't throw it away at the end of the term. Give it to the admin so they can keep it, because it will help us to give a record. We may even take a picture of it and keep it with each student's record. But basically, brothers and sisters, we really want each student to learn really well. We want to monitor their progress, their development, so let's put our best efforts into it. When you look at this form, please do not feel intimidated. It's so easy, this form. As you can see, the bottom part is just about what surah they are memorizing. Easy as anything. Top part is just their name and detail, simply about their Iqra books, putting a tick and the date. Here is just Abatatha as they learn it, easy. So this part is all easy. This part is what probably 80 to 90% of the Quran teachers are going to deal with. As for the other parts, which is Mad, Idgham and all of that, the miscellaneous about the other rules and the sifat, most of the teachers of the Quran are not going to be dealing with this. So please do not feel intimidated. You look at this part about Quran memorizing, look at the Abatatha, any of us knows that. Look at the Iqra book as they complete it. Easy, piece of cake. We can do it, and please do not forget to write the dates there clearly so that we can monitor the progress of a student and help them if they need help, and hopefully even the parents will be happy to see and willing to help if they feel that their child, this is their record, this is the help they need, so it would help us as well. Okay, that's all. If there are any questions, please let me know, and I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us success to instill these students with a love for the Quran and help them to read it beautifully so that they enjoy reading the Quran more than other people of the dunya enjoy listening or singing to the music themselves. And then also we give them the love to implement and live by the Quran. I pray Allah gives the success to do this for us and for our students. Ameen. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.